Welcome to Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies. We bring you real-life examples from global and local thought leaders, as well as experts working within the financial industry, and seek out the best stories from the front lines of financial services innovation, where dreams of industry pioneers meet reality. Hosted by Paul Krogdahl and Ville Sointu. This is Fintech Daydreaming.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Fintech Daydreaming. Today, first of all, I am Ville Sointu. I will be your host today for this episode, and my co-host, Paul Krogdahl, is right here with me. How are you doing, Paul?
I'm doing good. I'm wondering, Ville, are you saying that only for today you are Ville, or are you saying that only for today you are hosting the show?
Yeah, I think we'll leave that cliffhanger to be for a second, and let's see tomorrow on how we are. But at least for today, let's live by the day for now. And today, of course, we, as always, have a fantastic guest with us, but this time he is someone special. And one of the cool things about doing a podcast is that you get to say all the kind of fun cliches of all the kind of different kinds of media recordings. And the cliche today is that our guest today needs no introduction, because our guest today is Brett King. So Brett, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's it's early here in New York, but I'm in good shape, and very busy couple of weeks coming up with the new book launch. So
yeah, great. I think we'll hear all about the book later in our conversation. So again, really good to have you with us. I think you are our first recurring guest. You were here last season, and we're really
inaugural.
Happy to have you.
Yes, awesome.
And I actually think last time you were with us, you were in Singapore, right? So we are.
Oh, my home in Bangkok, yeah.
Bangkok, I think.
In Bangkok.
Yes.
So the next time we have you on, you need to be somewhere in Europe.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Welcome
We'll
to
see.
Finland.
We'll see if we can work that out. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been a while. I was in Oslo during the pandemic, but that's the closest I got. But we'll definitely. I would love to get back there.
All right. Good, Brett. You might or might not remember that we always start our shows on this podcast by having a fintech joke with us. Now, we've done a small change for this season, and we actually ask our guests to do the joke. And this might become us a bit of a surprise for you, but would you have a fintech joke for our audience?
Does it have to be a good one, or it can be a
no, absolutely not.
One?
We actually, it's better.
All right. So here's one I came up with back before the pandemic. Actually, it was, how many fintech entrepreneurs does it take to change a light bulb?
Don't know how many.
3. 1 to change the light bulb, 1 to raise the funding to change the light bulb, and 1 to write the API that makes the fintech compatible with the legacy energy system. All right.
Perfect. And what a lead in to this episode as well. Great stuff. And that was actually a pretty good one. So we actually used to having a really kind of bad ones, but this one was actually pretty good.
Good. Well, I got a chuckle. So yeah.
All right. But hey, Brett, you are here today for a special reason, and that is that the rumor has it that you've actually are going to release a new book soon. Last time we talked a lot about Bank 4.0. We talked about your previous book on future technologies, Augmented, but this is something new now. So why don't you start by telling all about the new book project?
Sure. So actually, this sort of came out of Augmented. 2018, January 2018, I woke up one morning with my Twitter feed blowing up because people saying that my book had been seen on President Xi's bookshelf. And it got me thinking, how is government and policy and strategy going to evolve over the future? Because, a lot of the problems that we face are really with sort of outmoded thinking, and we've got some big challenges coming up. And how's that going to reframe government and society and economics and so forth? So it was sort of like, all right, well, we know that what the technologies are going to be that are going to be thrust upon the world, but how's that going to change the way we think about human society and so forth? So this emerged, and Dr. Richard Petty and myself, Richard and I've known each other for 20 years. He's been involved in sort of global accounting standards bodies around the world over that period of time, and it does policy advisory work. And so we sort of got together and we started mapping out the various potential histories or future histories based on some of these changes that we thought, and based on the pressure that's coming on political systems and economic systems right now. And what came out of that was, what's the optimal approach for humanity? And so this resulted in us writing this book called The Rise of Technosocialism, and looking at how economic uncertainty that we see today, combined with AI, inequality, artificial intelligence already mentioned, and climate change, how that's going to reshape politics, economics, and so forth over the next 20 to 30 years. And so that was sort of a bit of the history of the project from our point of view. But yeah, the book is out in the next couple of weeks, and it really is, in terms of me personally, it is the biggest scope of any book I've written. I mean, talking about 30 to 50 years in our history, talking about changing governmental systems, talking about changing the role of work in society, global climate infrastructure and climate mitigation projects, forgiving national debt globally, so that can be used for these purposes. I mean, really big picture stuff. It's pretty ambitious as a project.
Wow.
To work on. Yeah.
So many questions on everything you just said there, but let me start from the obvious question, which is that everybody knows you as the host of the largest, or at least the most popular fintech podcast in the world. Everybody knows you as a banker through your previous books and your work with Moven. So what is the trajectory that takes a banker into being a futurist, like you are now kind of portraying yourself in this with this new book?
Well, so I would say that I've always been a futurist. I just chose to focus on the banking industry over the last decade because, I had a ton of experience in that space. But actually, I don't know if many people know this, but my first book I wrote, which didn't get published, was a sci-fi novel. And so that was when I was like 25. I wrote this, maybe 27. I wrote this sci-fi novel. And it was about colonization of Mars and Mars becoming economically independent, and the United Nations and the CIA sort of trying to undermine Mars's economic independence. But it was sort of a spy versus spy type book. But I've always been a technologist. I've always been interested in technology, how it will evolve. And most futurists, what we share as a characteristic is we just want to get to the future quickly. Right? Mm-hmm. And so when you look at what I've written about banking in that lens, that I've been writing for the last decade about getting us to the destination, which fintech is now showing us. As a futurist, but my interests have always been a little broader. And I think you get to a point in your career, in your life, where you sort of think of, once you reach some level of financial independence, and you sort of say, what can I do that's really going to make a difference? And that's really where I started with this book.
Yeah, I think the banking world certainly needs futurists, future futurists and people who are interested in that stuff, because it is exactly that type of thinking that moves the industry forward, as well as we have seen with your previous work and your books that you've written about the topic.
Thank you.
So really kind of great stuff. I can certainly identify myself somewhere in there as well. Maybe I'll go down that path as well sometime in the future. But you mentioned your book, which is called The Rise of Technosocialism. Now, I still enjoy quite a bit of techno music in my past, and socialism, of course, is quite familiar here in the Nordic countries, in one way or another. But combining the two words, I mean, could you kind of dig a little bit deeper on what is techno-socialism?
Yeah, the difference between this form of socialism and sort of the democratic socialism that we see in the Nordics and so forth. The big difference here is, from a political spectrum perspective, there's two main forces acting here. One is that we move to the right in terms of economic policies, particularly around size of government. And so we're using technology to dramatically shrink government and do better resource allocation. So that's sort of on the right. On the left, we're moving to much more collective social policy. And that's critical because the big problems that we face at a national level, the biggest problems will be techno unemployment as a result of high levels of automation. On a global level, the things we need to coordinate around, 300 million to 1 billion eco-refugees, the impact of climate change, rising sea levels, entire nations inundated in terms of their infrastructure, like Bangladesh, Maldives, Tuvalu, et cetera, these low-living Pacific islands as example, where you can no longer just have a national climate policy. It doesn't, even as we see out of COP26, is that you can have one of the top industrial nations like India basically refuse to meet their targets, and think about the effect that could have on the entire planet. Right. And so national climate policy doesn't work. We need global climate policy. We need global action on AI regulation, as an example. And so this is where we shift to the left in terms of collectivism. So you've got these two elements from a traditional political perspective, economics and in terms of financial fiscal responsibility and size of government, using technology to reduce the cost of delivery of those sort of services and the universal needs of citizens in the market, from an economics perspective, and moving to the left on the social policy stuff. So that sort of combines this new theory, right? It is, because the biggest problem that, if you take conservatives in the UK or the United States, for example, the biggest problem they would have with things like, better universal education or universal healthcare in the United States, as example, is they say, who's going to pay for it? Well, the answer to that in techno-socialism is I can deliver that to the nation at a fraction of the cost of the current system using technology. So, for example, with healthcare, we show a 70% reduction in the total healthcare system cost by 2040 in the United States using this methodology. And so if now I can provide you with universal healthcare at 30% of the cost of the existing system, how are you going to argue it's socialism? Right? Because it's cheaper than the existing system. It's better than the existing system. And so, get over the terminology and let's just fix the problem. And then on the other side, you can see there's been a lot more focus on individualism and things like that, individual rights, particularly during the pandemic, as far as mask wearing and these sorts of ridiculous things, right? Or taking the vaccination. But that's many decades in the making in terms of that sort of thinking. But we really must get back to much more of a collective view of humanity if we're going to succeed as a species. And that's really what the outcome of the book is looking for, is what is the optimal form of human existence? What's the optimal human species configuration? How do we get there, and what's best for our grandchildren and the future of the planet? And that's, it's a pretty grand objective, I grant you, but we play with the different themes and say, if we follow this theme, like currently the inequality we have, we call this emerging property neo-feudalism. right? Or this emerging state, neo-feudalism, where corporations get to set policy because they, buy the politicians, and this level of inequality ratchets up. So the rich get access to things like life extension therapies and gene therapy and things like this, the best technology, but the poor, don't get access to it. So, for example, you can follow that trend through and see where it will lead us, and it's suboptimal. And so, that's sort of the basis of the debate that we try to put in the book.
So
It's
in a way,
interesting.
techno-socialism is basically advocating for small government, not small in terms of what's actually coming out of it, small in terms of it being very efficient. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's a key argument in the book, that government doesn't need to be as complex as it is today. And in even the governance methodology, so we put mechanisms in there, we describe consensus-making mechanisms that avoid the whole problem of representative governments, where you've got an individual, like in the United States right now, you've got one senator who is holding up the entire legislation process around the new infrastructure and climate bill, because he is heavily sponsored by fossil fuel companies, right? As an example, right? And so it cuts that sort of those issues out by showing mechanisms to reach consensus on policy amongst the population, through technology as an example. But yeah, making big government small is a core element of the technosocialism, timeline.
I'm sensing some sort of undertones that make me think and reflect on the definitions around Society 5.0. Are you sort of aligning to that? Is there similarities here? Have you drawn some influence from the whole Society 5.0 thinking?
Look, I would say at the heart of it, the rise of technosocialism is about philosophy, which is, what are we here for? What's the purpose of humanity? What's the purpose of our economy? Where do we want to go in the future? These very big philosophical questions. And one core element of this is, the purpose of the economy. And this sort of goes to sort of the Society 5.0 thing, but it also incorporates the fourth industrial revolution thinking and so forth. But what's the purpose of the economy? And so let's use the US as an example. So, many economists will frame the economy as, the mechanisms of measuring the economy are GDP growth, trade deficits and surplus, stock market prices, these sort of traditional metrics that measure the growth of the economy. And so by those measures, the United States is clearly the most successful economy we've seen in history, although China now is emerging as a competitor to that label. But if you say, well, the purpose of an economy is to look after the needs of its citizens and to make the citizens of that nation happy and healthy, then by that measure, the US has demonstrably failed. And so, because you can't have the level of inequality and poverty we have, there's more people in the United States living under the poverty line than in Mexico, right? As an example. You can't have that level of disparity between the rich and the poor and say the economy has worked, because it doesn't work for everybody. It works for only a smaller and smaller group of the population. And so that we have not really thought about that in terms of economic policy on a global basis more broadly. Yes, we've got classic socialism and different approaches that we've tried, but no one's ever said, well, hang on a second, why are we doing all of this? What's the economy for? And there's arguments about, well, if you have a robust economy, you can do all of these social programs. This is Friedman, right? Milton Friedman, that your first job is to get the economy working, and then you can fix all these problems. But that's not the way in practice it works. You actually have to prioritize, fixing the problems at a core economy level. It has to be built into the economy. And so in the United States, you have poor quality education, you have poor quality healthcare, because even though the economy's been, the best, certainly in the 60s and 70s, the best economy the world ever seen, you're not really prioritizing those things at an economic level in terms of output of the economy. And that has, as we can see, negative effects on a longer term basis. So yeah, philosophy, why are we here? Aristotle said the purpose of humanity is to thrive. And the only way we thrive is working together. And that's the 21st century mantra. The more divided we are in the 21st century, the less progress humanity is going to make and the less successful we're going to be at solving big problems like climate change.
But don't you think technology to a certain degree is dividing us?
The way we currently think about economics and the way technology is currently used, absolutely. So here's the big problem with AI we talk about AI as a subset of technology, but AI is obviously a lot more than that. We're talking about the emergence of a new type of intelligence on the planet, so it's sort of big picture stuff. But how's it going to change the way our economy works? Well, the markets are very heavily incentivized globally to reward corporations that have low worker populations, right? And let me explain that. So if you look at 9 out of 10 of the largest companies in the world today are technology companies. Now, if you look 50 years ago at the largest economies in the world, they were the biggest employers, right? They had the most people working for them. And, like there are oil companies and big banks and things like that. They were huge companies. And the reason that those companies were large is it was resource conversion or resource extraction, or, it required a lot of manpower to make it work. But the tech companies that are the biggest companies in the world today, they require a lot less people working to produce the same economic output. So they can produce more profits per employee. So to illustrate, JP Morgan Chase, 180,000 employees, they generate about $500,000 of net earnings per employee. Ant Group, I think Ant Group has like 40,000 employees, but they generate 16 million net earnings per employee, right? And so the market rewards basically factoring humans out of the labor program. And when AI fits into that model, we accentuate that problem. And so we rapidly take humans out of the labor force. So supply and demand is no longer based on labor production, or labor facilitation, right? And so that detaching of the whole supply and demand from traditional sort of labor issues is a real problem, because as these companies grow, you don't employ more people. In fact, you employ less people, the more successful the market goes. And so that's going to result in massive technology unemployment if we let the market just go the way it naturally will go with this. So you now have to have mechanisms in place to say, well, is that the outcome we want when nobody works? Well, from an AI perspective, I mean, that is ultimately the goal, is that we can automate human society to a level where, we don't have to work. But in the transition from this current model to that future state, how do you make sure that people have enough food to eat, that they have a roof over their head? If they're going to be unemployed, if you're going to have 50% unemployment because of AI by 2045, as an example, how do you mitigate that? So we don't have the mechanisms for mitigating that right now, because the argument would be in classic, capitalist countries, if you don't work, you can't afford to live, right? That's your problem. Right?
I think that there's an interesting dichotomy here, right? You mentioned education a couple of times, and I'm just thinking, if we move into a world where people have the luxury of not actually needing to work, they need to find other ways of generating wealth and income. And one of the issues you've got there is, this notion, the traditional notion of work hard, earn your money, save it, and you will be financially looked after. That model doesn't work anymore. It's all
Correct.
about take your money and figure out how you utilize your money to make your money earn money for you. And this really comes down to the fact that we need to break the educational mold that's been put on top of society to educate them on financial literacy. I mean, financial literacy is degrading on an ongoing basis. And one of the things that then there's two things really. One is, how do we re-establish the educational need around financial well-being, money management, financial literacy? The other one is, how do we combat the issue that social media technology is bringing to us? I'll put it in a different way. Every generation have had their collection of, may I say, gullible idiots, right? The difference we've got now is that the gullible idiots of the old time were influenced by a very small community, and the impact of their actions were limited to that community or to the people close to them. These days, we've got global social influence. We've got people who are spreading knowledge which is not actually correct knowledge, and people are taking this on board as being, I now have knowledge, I've gained insights, but no validation as to whether that knowledge is true. Very often, we see people saying, get rich, buy Bitcoin. Maybe that is true, but most of the cases, this influential power is negative, not positive. So how do we deal with all of this in the context that you are now discussing, Brett?
Well, I think this is a bit of a transitional state. I think that we will come up with some universal values and universal truths, and we'll figure out a way to sort of underpin those. But we're in a state where misinformation is valued as equally as factual, data and statistics, and so that has to obviously change, and it only will change as the nature as we assess as a society that actually misinformation has done enormous economic harm, and affected people negatively. But from an education perspective, I think this is really critical. Is the one thing we describe in the book as the transition that work and employment will take, and I'll get to the financial question in a moment, is we look at the question of, when you meet someone in public for the first time, it's quite normal for us to ask, what do you do? And that's defined by, you answer, well, this is my job, right? This is what I do when for work. Whereas in the future, I think we're going to answer that very differently, which is, this is what I'm passionate about. Right. And that's the difference that this change in sort of economics will enable us. So we talk about universal basic income as a core outcome of this system. Now, a lot of people, again, who's going to pay for it? These are the debates that come up. We show 4 different methods of paying for universal basic income in the book. And we talk about those different approaches. But that is designed in a system where you can't necessarily get enough work to survive in terms of your basic needs. And so, this is the only viable mechanism that allows people to live, right? But that then leads you to, well, you may have work you do, which is to contribute from a pure economic output perspective, or on top of your universal basic income, so that you can afford the luxuries that you want, things like your new iPhone or whatever it might be. But the rest of the time, sort of finding your purpose is important. So when we look at the UBI trials that have taken place in Finland, for example, and in other areas of the globe, we see that the UBI has allowed people to explore entrepreneurialism where they couldn't previously afford the time off work to build their own business. They get involved more in community activities and things like that. So this is really thinking about how human resources can be allocated and doing things that people find they're more passionate about and more interested about. So then when you look at the financial side, financial literacy, the one thing you want to do as a priority, if the economy can afford it, is make sure that everybody has their basic needs covered. There's no such thing as homelessness. There's no such thing as food scarcity, that everyone has access to the best possible education that's available and the best possible healthcare that's available. That should be a goal of every economy, right? And so we look at resource allocation as the problem for that. How do we better allocate resources so that that outcome can be created? So for example, with virtual education, Yes, you could have a local component of education where kids still go to classrooms, but you could have a virtual component of that where you, by design, create, get the best teachers, the best curriculum, the best, educational content, and make it free and ubiquitous, right? As an example. Similarly for healthcare, if we look at healthcare, it's a data problem, right? So get the best data. 40% of diagnostics or diagnoses in healthcare are wrong today in modern economies, right? So you've got a 40% chance when you go to a doctor with a serious health condition that they're going to guess something wrong, right? AI will remove that because AI in diagnostics is already outperforming humans. 40% of healthcare costs in the United States are administrative costs. So you can eliminate them with robotic process automation, as an example, then gene therapy and personalized medicine and all of those other things on top. When we look at financial literacy, then in that landscape is the really interesting piece of this is, well, first of all, I've got an economy that looks after your basic needs. So you don't have to worry ever about getting enough money to eat. That I've removed that problem. So now that you can have money on top of that, or you can have resources, what's the most valuable resources you could have as an individual? Well, maybe it's time. Maybe it's the fact that you don't have to work in a job that puts the money, the food on the table, for example, is that now you can do something that you're really passionate about. And I think that's obviously a very philosophical change in terms of the way we think about work and its role in society in respect to our wealth. Maybe it is that we should be valuing time as our greatest asset rather than money. And then, our deployment of our own time resources becomes a choice that we have in a very different way in highly automated societies.
Yeah, I think now that we've painted this kind of picture of society, government, philosophy, kind of maybe the understanding of value becoming something else, universal basic income, all of these new concepts in the kind of techno-socialist vision that we're painting here. The next obvious question, of course, and this might be just the fintech nerd in us talking, but what is the role of a bank? How will financial services work in this future society? Will it be something completely different?
There's a really interesting book that I read last summer, which was called The Ministry of the Future by an author called Kim Stanley Robinson. For those that are listening to the podcast, after you've read The Rise of Technosocialism, I recommend reading Ministry of the Future. But in it, he proposes sort of a global credit union that's based on a global cryptocurrency or central bank digital currency called a carbon coin. And that becomes the way that we pay for the climate mitigation and things like that, but also sort of changes the way currency works in terms of priorities and so forth. But the reason for the whole global credit union concept, which is sort of digitally, is that banks, in terms of what they fund, for example, today funding fossil fuel projects and coal mines and things like that, is that it puts the power back into the hands of the banked community in terms of how the bank goes, and also sort of removes it from that sort of central bank layer. So he proposes this global digital bank that is starting to compete with central banks. So the decentralization thing. There's a very good question in the future is that, if money doesn't have the role that it has in society today, then why do you need the banking infrastructure? Why do you need financial literacy? This is an even bigger topic, the role of money in society, which we didn't tackle significantly because it's a longer term thing. But I think if you go 100 years in the future, then I don't think your bank will be important in terms of your day-to-day lifestyle necessarily. You may have some resources that you allocate and you put in a digital vault or something like that. But I don't think money and banks will have the role that they have in society today. So the answer is, as humanity evolves and advances, then the role money has in society must also logically change, and that will change. But we're talking about 100 years in the future here. Over the medium term, this shift to a completely digital economy and automated cities, automated elements of society means that digitization of currency and digitization of trade and commerce is a given. Right. And so in highly automated societies, you're going to have machine-to-machine interactions, you're going to have machine-to-people interactions, you're going to have all of these different complexities, which leads to digitization of money, currency, and commerce. Alibaba's talking about you being able to order goods and services and have them shipped anywhere in the world within 72 hours, right, as an example. And so that's real-time commerce. So you need currencies that are designed for that type of real-time view of commerce in the world. And so fiat currencies, where you convert from physical cash to a digital version of it, and you're bounded by geographical rules in terms of that fiat currency, they don't make sense in that world. And so the natural emergence of digital currencies that work better and have different incentives built into them. So things like carbon coins, or things like currencies that have utility, that generate benefits for mankind or reduce the impact of climate change, as an example. We'll be able to do those sorts of really interesting things. We'll be able to have solar panels and autonomous vehicles sort of trading each other, one trading hours driven for solar energy generated on the panels and things like that. Really out there sort of concepts, but this is the digitization of the world.
Yeah, for sure. And so many questions that I could ask about the future society and digital trust, but I'm going to pick
the sci-fi coming in, right?
Yeah, clearly. And but one thing I picked up there that is actually something that is already happening in the world today, in the short or even medium term, which is the central bank digital currencies. Now, after what you just said and how you see this 100-year in the future and how the CBDCs might play a role in that, how you kind of bridge that to what's happening today, for example, in China, of course, in Sweden, and with the digital euro in the European Union.
Right. So, China has really led the world in terms of CBDC. They're now live in like a dozen cities. They've doing cross-border with Hong Kong and Singapore at the same time using CBDC, wallets, e-wallets. They've enlisted the support of Alipay and Tencent WeChat Pay in rolling out the CBDCs. But I want you to imagine a world in 5 or 6 years' time. It's not that far away, where now, we've got past the pandemic stuff. We are now starting to really build trade up again. And China has invested trillions of dollars in this Belt and Road Initiative. And, you've got these ports in Africa, you've got farmland they own in Africa, you've got, production capabilities all around supporting global trade on this. And China says, all right, you must transact on if you want to transact on the Belt and Road and be part of the world's largest economy, which is China now, you have to do so with the E1. Right. And so now trade on the Belt and Road is based on China's CBDC. And that's the way they displace the petrodollar as the world's currency. But they do so based on the CBDC rather than, a digital version of the yuan as a fiat currency. It really is sort of purpose built. So that's, I think that's really the key element here, is they're designing a new way of thinking about global trade in real time, using artificial intelligence and smart supply chain and all of these things underpinned by this currency. The US is still trying to think about, well, the commodities world and, the stock markets and how, how that could be undermined by the CBDC, instead of sort of thinking about what's the future of the US dollar look like. And it's only, that's why the US has dragged their feet on this, because they know that the petrodollar is dominant, and if they move to a CBDC in the US, they're also competing against the petrodollar, and so they're sort of holding off on that, I think. So I think the CBDC coming out of China is obviously going to be the default currency in many ways for global trade because of that in fairly short order. And you're going to have this new world of currency versus old world currency sort of fighting it out for dominance. I'm not sure the US will ever get serious about a CBDC. We'll see. There's a lot of debate internally here in the US right now on that, and that gives China a clear opportunity.
What about stable coins in this discussion? I mean, we've got fiat currencies, we've got central bank digital currencies, we've got all the world of cryptocurrencies, but stuck in the middle of that is this growth of stable coins. What do you think to that?
Well, obviously there's been some debate recently on Tether and, their underpinnings, but, it's a great example of a stable coin. It is clear that there are going to be alternatives to sort of the central bank versions of currency. And I think the real opportunity there is, again, based on utility, is what's the utility function of the coin. You want, like Bitcoin's turned into an asset class. It's not really a currency per se. It's digital gold. It's a hedge against other currencies, and people are investing in it for speculation, not because they want to buy stuff using Bitcoin. So stable coins, because their value is stable, tend to be much more useful for value exchange and competing. But where that gets really interesting is when you start having stable coins with a mission. Right? Stable coins with some characteristic to them that give people a preference to use that currency. Well, I prefer to use this currency because it fits with my economic values or my ethical view of the world, as an example. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of experimentation around that. Climate coins, carbon coins, those sorts of things emerge, and people starting to use those because of the goodwill that is attached to those, or the utility that's attached to them.
Now, I'm going to use the stablecoin as a kind of a weak segue to our final question, since we're kind of almost running out of time here, which is that Facebook has been busy experimenting with stable coins. They're obviously trying to do their own wallet initiative. But today, I actually wanted to talk to you about especially the vision of the metaverse.
Yes.
That Mark Zuckerberg put forward just a few weeks ago, as we're talking now in the beginning of November. So how do you see that kind of vision of future that Facebook is portraying in the metaverse? Is that complementary to your vision of techno-socialism and the principles we've been just discussing?
Yeah, there's really two areas where there's going to be significant growth in employment opportunities. One is obviously around climate. So climate mitigation, geoengineering, climate resilience in terms of infrastructure, feeding displaced people, housing displaced individuals. We're talking about massive industrial growth, particularly sort of from the 2040s onwards in terms of these climate related industries. But the second area is the digital world, right? The emerging digital world. And people will, I think, live their entire careers, in the metaverse or the various versions of the metaverse. I'd like to see, hopefully, like the internet, it sort of comes together as a collection of different technologies that synergize around one sort of metaverse protocol or something like that. But, maybe it'll be like the Android versus iOS operating systems as well, we see. But people will be able to have entire careers and build, that they'll have a competing economic structure in the metaverse where they can be incredibly wealthy in the metaverse, and that wealth in the metaverse allows them to get access to real world, objects or real world wealth as well. So we're definitely going to have this sort of virtual world emerge where people can live their best life in the virtual space. But I think as UBI comes into place and so forth, then I'm hopeful that the metaverse will be more about entertainment and sort of where you spend some leisure time in, rather than sort of replacing the physical world necessarily. But it is interesting to see, part of the digitization of our world and, sort of creating this representative, virtual worlds of us gives us the ability to do things we couldn't naturally do, in the physical world. So it has an attraction to it. But how do we connect it? How do we connect it? So I think, again, think about ethics, think about morality, think about those things that we need to sort of build into society. How do we make the metaverse generate things that have positive real world impact as well? That's something that I think we have to solve the problem for.
Yeah, and I think that is really a key topic that we need to discuss in the future, which is that how does the metaverse connect with the meat space, so to say?
Yeah, exactly.
What is the bridge there, and is there any bridge? Is it something
Absolutely.
completely isolated, or how it's going to play out?
Might be just me showing my age, but it's Welcome to the Matrix jumps into my head.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it is a little like that. Sorry, Ville.
All right, guys. We could be talking here for the rest of the night, and I surely would enjoy that as well. But unfortunately, time flies when you are having fun like we are today, and we are out of time for this discussion. Brett King, thank you so much for being a guest with us, as always. We will definitely be looking forward to reading the book as soon as it's available. Now, Brett, how can people find out more about you, get connected, and most importantly, I guess, where can they find the book?
Yeah, well, you can go to riseoftechnosocialism.com or technosocialism.com, and you'll see the book trailer and the various outlets where you can buy the book, both online and in the physical world. Or you can just go to brettking.com, which is my website, and we redirect through there to the book as well.
Thanks again so much for being with us. And thank you to our dear audience for sticking with us for yet another fun episode of Fintech Daydreaming. Now, we are getting closer to Christmas, but we are still only have one Christmas present wish in our heads, which is that please subscribe to our podcast in your podcast application or YouTube application of choice. We do love the subscriptions, but we also love comments and reviews of the podcast, especially if it's a 5-star one. We truly would help other people to find the podcast as well. Now, that being said, we will be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode, but up until then, this has been Fintech Daydreaming.
This is Fintech Daydreaming.